So, good evening, everyone. My name is Veronica, and as you can hear from my accent, I have Latin roots. I came to Norway about 8 years ago to pursue my master's education in economics, though my real motivation was to hook up with a Viking. However, as I got to learn more about Norway and its Viking history, I realized that the Viking Age, there was a lot of entailment into the success of building ships and embarking on voyage and on trading, and that it was actually the Viking ship, one of the greatest technical achievements of the Europe's Middle Age. However, if we now fast forward to the 21st century, this is how a ship looks today. So to give you some perspective, the largest ship, they can transport 21,000 containers. And there are roughly about 50,000 merchant ships transporting all sorts of cargo around the world. So, however, in the age of flight and space, the shipping industry is very unknown for actually most people. However, if you stop and think about all the goods you own, about 90% of them have been transported by sea. That's pretty remarkable, right? The shipping also contributes to about 3% of the total global emissions, so keep this fact in mind. So we also have the 17 goals for development. However, they were developed by the United Nations, and what are applicable for us is that they talk about improving energy efficiency, and how are we going to tackle the climate change measurements, and how are we going to reduce marine pollution. We also have the International Maritime Organization, which is a specialized agency of the United Nations, and they have actually said in 2018 that by 2050, the shipping industry should have reduced its total gases emission by 50%. Now, the question for the industry and for us, the academics, is how are we going to do that? Well, we really have basically two choices. We have switching to alternative fuels, so that produce less CO2 or none at all, such as LNG, hydrogen, ammonia, or we go for batteries and solar and wind energy. The second alternative is really no-brainer. Let's just use less fuel. This is a Toyota RAV4, very popular in the 90s in America, because you know Americans, they like their things big. And you could reach higher distances with using less fuel. So that's what made this car so successful. It used less fuel. However, alternative fuels means that we would need to build new ships. That's really expensive. So the second alternative is actually to work toward making the ship fuel efficient. But how are we going to do that? Well, that's where data comes into place. But we need a lot of it. Therefore, the term big data. So basically, big data, it's a lot of data. So much data that our normal computers can't really use. We call big data the 4 V's because you have volume, which is a lot of data. You also have velocity, because there's a lot of data generated at all times. We also call it variety, because it's not just numbers. It can also be images, audio, etc. Now, in the ship, there's a lot of data being produced. We have communication data, we have weather data, we have what's happening with the engines, where a lot of the data that is produced in the ship is really not used. So why is that? Now, if we think about how to make the ship more efficient, we think about speed. So those of you who drive, you know that the faster you go, the more gasoline you're burning. So we need to know what's the speed that the ships are using. We also have weather data. It also plays a really important role because it affects currents, it affects waves, it affects wind, which incurs in using more fuel. If you can just imagine all these waves on a ship going through, it has to use basically more power to get through, right? And of course, we also have engines. This is how large ship engines are. And they're packed with sensors all around, which is basically monitoring the engine and its components, and it's really telling us how much fuel we're using. So this is really one of our stars when it comes to data generation. However, I think that by this point, you might be wondering, well, how is all of this data going to help? What can we do with all this data? Well, I can tell you that we can have a lot of data, but without analyzing it, it's basically useless. So we have the term big data analytics, which is basically let's make sense of all this data. So often the methodology that we have for this is called machine learning. So the idea is that we put all of these big data sets in the computer and we use algorithms. So basically we're kind of getting recipes and trying to figure out what's the best combination of all this data, right? And then ultimately, the whole idea of doing this machine learning is saying, okay, we have a ship. So how do we transport it from port A to port B using the less fuel as possible, but still like making it happen, reaching there on time, right? So this is one of the ideas of using data. How can we do the best voyage optimization, right? There's also another characteristic of this is that we will be able to use about 10 to 30% in reduction of the fuel saving. So this basically means that if we are using less fuel, we're going to have less CO2 being released into the air, and therefore getting closer into our IMO target. So if you think about it, data really does play an important role in all of this problem. Because remember, we cannot improve what we cannot measure. Now, ultimately, the whole the whole idea of this research is that we want to achieve less CO2. We want to have better environment. We also want to have our industry still running and having profit. And basically calling this the shipping of the future. So, thank you very much.